And whatever. But there's 17 years in versions of everything.
It was changed.
Oh, okay.
I missed the, the brackets. Oh, you did? I don't now believe under first.
That's all right. I would never be able to figure this out.
Share screen.
Lost anyway, but none of that. But I would have picked things like really.
Okay.
I just talked about it. But it's kind of like betting on.
Hey, can you guys hear me on the Zoom call?
We can.
Yes.
I turn it off now because it's supposed to die.
Okay, so this is the mic that's actually plugging.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Great, everybody. So let's get started. If you're on Zoom, maybe this is your first time. So would you please mute yourself? That would be great. I'm delighted to introduce two of our wonderful doctoral students. They're all wonderful. I'm going to introduce them both, and then they'll be sharing parts of what is known as that paper that they write. So Sonia Mendoza-Grey is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociomedical Sciences. She applies training in human biology, sociology, and qualitative research to her dissertation research, which examines the implications of precision medicine for the Latinx population. Specifically, her work investigates how recruitment and analysis of the Latinx population shapes and informs understandings of Latinidad, and how researchers work with Latinx populations illuminates connections among genetics, ethnicity, and race through bioscience. Her work has received support from the National Science Foundation Doctoral Dissertation Research Improvement Grant, which we know is hard to get, and her sponsor is Beck Jordan Young. Alyssa Basmajian, who will be speaking after Sonia, is also a PhD candidate in the department. Her research interests are grounded in the social and political tensions surrounding reproductive health in the United States. That is perhaps the biggest understatement ever. For her dissertation research, she's been investigating the politics of abortion care in Ohio. Basmajian has received support from the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship, the NIH Predoctoral Training Program in Gender, Sexuality, and Health, and the National Science Foundation Doctoral Dissertation Research Improvement Grant. So Sonia's going to come up to the podium. She'll speak, then she'll pass the stage over to Alyssa, who will be joining us virtually, and then there'll be questions after that. Take it away.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm going to excuse myself because I'm under the weather. So if I cough or you hear my lozenge, I apologize. So thank you very much. Today I will be talking about Latinidad in precision medicine, specifically my current work examining the emergence of imagined genetic communities. And before I get started, I do want to say that throughout this presentation, I may use the terms Latino and Latinx and if quite interchangeably. And unless I otherwise note, I mean this as gender inclusive terms. So here's an outline of what this presentation will cover. First, I'll give an overview of why I focus on the Latinx population and why precision medicine took an interest in the population, followed by research questions and ending with key preliminary findings and some inquiries that are driving my data collection as I wrap up. First and foremost, it's important to underscore in any conversation about Latino population that the Latino category itself is a political and social construct specific to the United States. Throughout Latin America, there's no real use for the pan-ethnic terms of Latino or Hispanic, as most individuals identify by their nationality or specific regional or tribal membership. It's also important to acknowledge that the Latin American population, as we see it now, emerged from European colonialism. Over the last several centuries, Latin American populations have been colonized, enslaved, intermixed, and displaced by European forces, adding to the destabilization and diversification of communities that we see today. And this small map is just a little like historical overview of the European forces in Latin America. There's also a long geopolitical history in the United States of overlapping territories and of migration, especially with Mexico, as it's clear when you see the large Mexican territory loss. I'll move this for the group here. After the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, with Mexico losing almost half of its landmass. A more modern day example that illustrates this liminal state of Latino belonging in the United States is the case of Puerto Rico. The terms Hispanic and Latino began to be formally used in the United States fairly recently. The term Hispanic first appeared in the 1970 census, and the term Latino was first used in the 2000 census. Recently, the Biden administration proposed yet another update to the census that would no longer ask a separate question about Latino/Hispanic ethnicity, but this category would now be embedded among other multiple choice categories without singling it out as the only ethnic option. You can see an example of what that will look like during this yellow outline. So it's clear that the political category of Latinx is dynamic and it's evolving. Given these definitions, the Latino population is vast and growing in the United States, with over 62 million of us in the US as of 2020. We come from all over Latin America, but we are primarily represented by individuals of lineages tracing to Mexico, Puerto Rico, and El Salvador. Number 3, El Salvador is usually neck and neck with Cuba, with people with Cuban descent. There are also differences across where communities of different origins live throughout the United States. As you can see here in the middle graph, the largest population of Mexican communities live in Los Angeles, California, and Houston, Texas. Puerto Rican communities can mostly be found in Providence, Rhode Island, and the New York areas. And Salvadorans are primarily located in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. So not only are we diverse in where we come from, but also where we settle down and the different municipal and state laws that impact our health and our access to social resources. So I hope this very brief overview of the Latino population in the US has given you a glimpse of just how complex and heterogeneous this group truly is. However, the Latinx population is not only diverse in regards to country of origin and geopolitics, but Latinos are also diverse in regards to culture, linguistics, our nativity status, and what is more relevant to us here in this room in regards to our health profiles. So why is precision medicine interested in the Latinx community? As most of us are aware in this room, there's a strong precedent of racialized approach to medicine in the US. First, in the sense that there was an omission or exploitation of ethnic and racial minorities in health research, and then in an attempt to correct the lack of representation, the explicit recruitment and accounting for minorities in research. Despite the formalized effort of inclusion that began in the mid-1980s, in 2016, Popejoy and Fullerton published a Nature magazine article that highlighted the vast underrepresentation of ethnic and racial minorities in genome-wide association studies. And this is global data, not just for the United States. They found that in 2009, of 1.7 million samples, 96% were of European ancestry. And in 2016, as GWAS studies proliferated to 35 million samples, European ancestry samples still made up 81% of all data. Of note, the slight decrease in the proportion of European sampling was primarily due to the burgeoning of GWAS studies in Asia. Seeing persistent and vast disparity in genomic and health research, former President Barack Obama launched the All of Us and Precision Medicine Initiative in 2016. This national program is, quote, an innovative approach to disease prevention and treatment that takes into account individual differences in people's genes, environments, and lifestyles, end quote. In order to achieve this, the goal is to collect data from over 1 million US participants. And here at Columbia, we have the privilege of being part of that New York City consortium. The initiative focuses on recruitment of ethnic and racial minority groups with the assumption that by capturing racial and ethnic populations, we can achieve precision medicine. However, given the vast heterogeneity of the Latino population that we just overviewed, I was wondering how this was going to be approached. And to really dive in why my curiosity was piqued, I'll disclose a little bit about my family. So here in the slides are pictures of my biological cousins, Teresa and Lorena, with me there in the middle. So they're both my first cousins, Teresa from my mom's side and Lorena from my father's side. For most research purposes, as data points, we are exactly the same. We have immigrant Mexican parents living our adult lives in the United States with lineage to the same region and town in Mexico from both our maternal and our paternal sides. But as you can see, we are at least phenotypically look very different. Those of us who took high school biology can name a few dominant and recessive genes here. So given even this anecdotal example of my family, I began to wonder, how would precision medicine take into account the deep heterogeneity of the Latino population? On a broader scale, given the geopolitical, linguistic, cultural, and biological heterogeneity, my dissertation examines how a real and fictive community of Latinx comes to be meaningful in the field of health. How would this unique community impact the fundamental question of finding genomic foundations for disease and for healing? To begin to delve into these questions, I've employed qualitative analysis consisting of content analysis, ethnographic observations, key informant interviews, and lay participant interviews. To date, I've compiled and analyzed 100 clinical precision medicine articles from 2016 to 2020. I've attended over 21 precision medicine events with a focus on all of us, and have conducted 23 precision medicine key informant interviews and 40 lay informant interviews in either Spanish or English. I've conducted analysis using Atlas TI, and I'm primarily employing iterative code generation with my dissertation sponsor, Dr. Rebecca Jordan-Young. In my review of 100 PubMed articles concerning Latinos and precision medicine, it was no surprise to learn that there's a substantial amount of sources for data and information, with more than 52 biobanks, programs, studies, and databases cited as resources for studying the Latinx population in the context of precision medicine. What was surprising is that a total of 97 different terms emerged from the analysis that refer to Latinx data or Latinx population. This varied from broad terms such as admixed population or simply as other, to more specific terms such as the name of a small tribal group. All 97 terms were used as biogeographical ties to Latin America, and these were specific terms to identify study participants or data. These terms emerged from varying means, such as through self-identification, nationality, through either genetic or political ancestry, and were meant to describe data or study participants as categorically different from other data or study participants. Of note, the terms were not mutually exclusive within articles. So I aim to examine whether this splitting and categorization within the Latinx population results in what sociologist Stephen Epstein calls the inclusion and difference paradigm. According to Epstein, the inclusion of ethnic and racial minorities and women led to the demarcation of these groups as distinct from white or European male subjects. This in turn led to the emphasis on health deficiencies and poor health outcomes based on sex and the short list of defined ethno-racial minority groups that emphasized negative embodied differences in lieu of underscoring drivers of health differences, such as sociopolitical and sociocultural variances. Sorry, sociopolitical and sociostructural variances. So while Epstein's work took into account all racial and ethnic categories, as well as sex, what ultimately is at play for the Latinx category is the formalized inclusion of these subgroup populations that may ultimately lead to a new form of characterization of groups and fundamentally of human bodies as distinct bodies with distinct health outcomes along a defined set of characteristics. Now, in my interviews with key informants thus far, I've had the privilege of speaking with world-renowned molecular geneticists, physicians, genetic epidemiologists, principal investigators, genetic counselors, and community health experts whose work centers on precision medicine and Latinos. What has been most impactful has been their candor in acknowledging the complexities tied to the study of Latino participants and Latino data in the context of precision medicine. They all express the need for representation and data concerning Latinos. But what has also been an almost universal comment from these key informants, regardless of their training or their area of expertise, is their emphasis on the need for acknowledgement of the social determinants of health. What has emerged thematically is also an emphasis from key informants on a differentiation between their own personal domain of knowledge in regards to the Latino population versus their domain of responsibility to the population. For lay Latinos, a key finding in my interviews with them has been that the understanding of the tie between Latino identity and health greatly varies across demographics. For example, thus far, for younger participants, Latino identity seems salient and at the forefront of the priorities as something to be understood and untangled, whereas older participants do not seem to make this a priority at this stage of their lives. Major themes of discrimination, in-group racism, personal journeys of discovery, and acceptance of the Latino identity have also emerged in these interviews. There is a high rate of acknowledgement of behavioral and cultural practices and how these relate to health, with very few interviewees making any. Oh, sorry.
It's cool. They should do an something like that for the MTA.
Try to mute. I don't see it, but okay, hopefully we'll be okay.
Was your Venus yoga stuff?
It was very straightforward.
Should I continue?
Say into the microphone.
Sadie, can you please mute? Oh, there you go. Okay, great. So, where was I? Okay, so there's an acknowledgement of cultural practices and how they relate to health, with very few interviews making any connection between their biology and their health experiences. Despite the acknowledgement of culture and behavior on their health, very few have made any mention of socio-political barriers as negatively impacting their health. So as I finalize my data collection and analysis, the main inquiries driving this last stage are: how does the subgroup differentiation and variance of the Latino category impact precision medicine research? And given that Hispanic is one of the most operative terms of ethnicity that usually stands in opposition to race, how will collecting this information impact precision medicine and the old guard of racialized medicine, especially given the proposed changes to the census? So with that, I'd like to say thank you all very much for your time, and with a special thanks to my dissertation committee and those who've helped me along the way. So thank you.
So now we're gonna pivot, I hope seamlessly, from the physically present to the virtually present. Great, okay, Alyssa, looks like you got it. I'm just not sure how to,
Okay, can you see? Okay, great. Okay. So my name is Alyssa, and I'm going to talk a bit about a piece of my dissertation research. And the title of my presentation today is Reproductive Gerrymandering, Bureaucratic Violence, and the Erosion of Abortion Access in the US. And these are some photos from my dissertation research from abortion rallies I attended, and a screenshot of the New York Times headline the day of the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Supreme Court decision, overturning Roe v. Wade and the legal right to abortion. And bear with me, I'm working with two screens, so I might be a little slow to change to the next slide. And just to give a brief overview of my research design, so this was an ethnographic study done in Ohio from November 2021 to February 2023. I conducted participant observation in places like city ordinance meetings and state house hearings concerning abortion legislation, and pro-abortion and pro-choice informational events and rallies. I also conducted 42 semi-structured interviews with abortion doulas, abortion support organizers, policy analysts, and healthcare staff. And I also did 5 follow-up interviews after the Dobbs decision with healthcare staff and abortion support organizers who I had done primary interviews with before the Dobbs decision. And in terms of my research questions at the start of my project, so these research questions were: how do social and economic inequalities figure into the abortion patient experience, provision of care, and advocacy? How do everyday acts of resistance to anti-abortion legislation take shape? And what lessons can be learned from efforts to provide care when access to abortion is scarce? And if you're wondering, well, but why did I pick Ohio for this study? So besides these lovely photos of Lake Erie, which I took last summer, so Ohio is characteristic of polarizing debates happening across the US concerning fetal personhood and what's known as the war on women. For these reasons, Ohio exemplifies many other states across the southern and Midwestern US. Ohio also used to be considered a political bellwether or swing state. However, in recent years, Ohio's purple status has been questioned, and it has been considered more of a red state. So when I first moved to Ohio, I was wondering why this dramatic shift had occurred. And as I began to speak with Ohioans, I quickly found that gerrymandering was connected to anti-abortion legislation. And I have a quote here from Charlotte, and just so you know, all of the names throughout this presentation are pseudonyms. So Charlotte, a policy expert and political organizer, says, Ohio is not a 90% red state. Ohio is a rigged state, and that rigging is happening by very specific people who have a lot of power. Power that was not necessarily given to them by the people of Ohio. And when Charlotte talks about rigging, she's referring to gerrymandering. And I also just want to point out, so the photo that I have here is from a rally for abortion access, and it was outside the Ohio State House this past January. But if you're wondering, but what is gerrymandering? So every 10 years after the census is taken, state governments must create new electoral districting maps. And gerrymandering is the manipulation of electoral district lines to benefit one political party or group. To be clear, this presentation focuses on Republican gerrymandering, but both Republicans and Democrats can and do gerrymander. And as I continued to speak with Ohioans and policy analysts in particular, they emphasize the effects of the Great Gerrymander of 2012. So in 2010, Republicans launched a program called the Redistricting Major Project, and they focused especially on swing states like Ohio to fund political strategists to gerrymander. And they funded the use of redistricting software to successfully redraw state and congressional districts to ensure that they would have a sizable advantage in upcoming elections. And one of the more obvious ways that gerrymandering works is by increasing the number of representatives who win elections. So since 2011, Ohio Republicans have gained 7 state House seats and 3 state Senate seats. Currently, Republicans hold a 67-32 supermajority in the state House and a 26-7 supermajority in the state Senate. Republican representatives hold the majority of the political power in Ohio, and this allows them to easily pass legislation that aligns with their party's agenda. But one of the less obvious ways that gerrymandering works is through non-competition. So non-competition means that if we know that one party is likely to win a particular district, then the political race is no longer between a Republican and a Democrat, but is between the party's primary candidates, in this case, the Republican Party. And we know that during the primary, more conservative extremists tend to vote. This leads to more extremism among Republican Party candidates because they must appeal to a small portion of extremist conservative voters, and that gives rise to candidates that promote anti-abortion rhetoric and the severe limiting or banning of abortion. And so while I was doing my fieldwork, I needed a way to theorize this connection between gerrymandering and the passage of anti-abortion legislation, and came up with this concept of reproductive gerrymandering to better understand this connection and better explain this connection. And I define reproductive gerrymandering as the deliberate manipulation of electoral districts to benefit the Republican Party, which leads to conservative extremism and is then connected to the passage of unpopular legislation restricting reproductive healthcare access. And I use this term to describe contexts like Ohio, where the majority opinion of voters is not in line with their representatives who pass restrictive anti-abortion legislation. And I have a quote here from Ava. And Ava says, "What are the real life impacts of those bills that get passed by gerrymandered legislators who don't reflect the views of Ohioans? Half of Ohio's abortion clinics have shuttered in the last 10 years. That is not coincidental that has happened in the last decade. What does it mean when they pass these ambulatory license bills?" And to be clear, so ambulatory license bills are just a type of anti-abortion legislation, and they're meant to close down abortion clinics. So she says, what does it mean when they pass these ambulatory license bills that people don't pay attention to? It means I call up my doctor and I can no longer go to the abortion clinic that is 20 minutes away from my house. And I now have to go to one that is 3 hours away. That is a real life impact that people then can understand, but maybe at first didn't think that's because of gerrymandering. And so since 2011, so since this great gerrymander, we've had roughly 30 laws restricting reproductive access that have been passed in Ohio. In 2011, we had 26 abortion providing facilities. Now we have 9, 2 of which only provide medication abortion up until 10 weeks of pregnancy. And for about 2.5 months this past summer, we had a heartbeat ban in effect, which bans abortion after about 6 weeks of pregnancy. And just to sort of explain what that means, so if someone has a regular menstrual cycle of about 28 days, they would know that they're pregnant usually around week 5 or week 6. So this is essentially a near total ban on abortion. And I also want to point out that I put heartbeat in quotations because an actual heart has not formed at about 6 weeks of pregnancy. That's actually medically and scientifically inaccurate to say heartbeat. But I just want to point out how extreme the legislation has been. And if you're wondering, but what do Ohioans want? So 10% of Ohioans support a complete ban on abortion, whereas 55% of Ohioans would like abortion to be legal in most or all cases. So these near complete or complete bans on abortion are only representing about 10% of Ohioans. And in this piece of my dissertation, I'm arguing that reproductive gerrymandering is a highly effective form of bureaucratic violence, which is a type of structural violence arising from schematization, paperwork, and procedures. And structural violence is when a social structure or social institution causes harm to people by preventing them from being able to meet their basic needs. And basic needs can include things like food, shelter, or healthcare. In this case, abortion care. So redistricting and map-making procedures allow for the advancement of anti-abortion agendas, which causes structural harm to pregnant people. And a further example of hidden bureaucratic violence is in the Ohio biennial budget. So the Ohio state budget is passed every 2 years. And in the state budget, there's funding for a pregnancy and parenting program, which is used to fund crisis pregnancy centers. And crisis pregnancy centers are facilities run by anti-abortion organizations. They tend to hold religious affiliations. They tend to misrepresent themselves as health centers providing medical and informational services. They function to dissuade people from seeking an abortion. And they tend to provide medical misinformation about abortion risks. And they are a primary facet of the anti-abortion movement in the US. And here I have a quote by Ava, and she says, "They often find a way to stick anti-abortion or anti-repro health organization provisions into the budget. All of them in my recent memory include grants to crisis pregnancy centers. They'll gut funding that goes to Planned Parenthood or other similar reproductive healthcare organizations as virtue signaling. They'll say we're cutting funding because we don't want our money to go to abortion, and it literally doesn't. It's against federal law. Instead, they provide millions of dollars to go to crisis pregnancy centers." And I want to point out, so when Ava says it's against federal law, she's referring to the Hyde Amendment. So the Hyde Amendment does not allow federal money to go to abortion services. And the funding that goes to the pregnancy and parenting program is from TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families funding. And the funding that used to go to Planned Parenthood went to services like cervical and breast cancer screenings, not to abortion. And funding these crisis pregnancy centers is supporting an anti-abortion mission because grant recipients of the Ohio Parenting and Pregnancy Program must specify that they will promote alternatives to abortion, in other words, childbirth or adoption, in order to receive state funding. And in Ohio, over $10.5 million has been distributed to crisis pregnancy centers for fiscal years 2022 and 2023. And to give you an idea of the number of crisis pregnancy centers versus abortion clinics in Ohio, so we currently have 9 abortion providing facilities and 120 to 130 crisis pregnancy centers. So there are about 13 times the number of crisis pregnancy centers than there are abortion clinics, and these centers receive funding from taxpayers. And to give you an idea of what the landscape looks like across the US, so at least 13 other states across the US route millions of dollars in state funding to crisis pregnancy centers. As of January 2023, 14 states have banned abortion with very few exceptions, and 10 others are likely to pass near total abortion bans. And you can see in the map that I have below, there are large regions of the US that do not have access to abortion care. Yet only 13% of Americans want abortion to be illegal in all circumstances. So these total and near total abortion bans represent a very small portion of Americans. Reproductive gerrymandering can be used to better understand this connection between Republican partisan gerrymandering and anti-abortion legislation that is passed even though it does not represent the views of the majority of voters. Thank you.
Okay, we did it. So, Sonia, I don't know if you want to come up in case people have questions for you, and I think that, you and Alyssa can just take turns. I'll pass the mic around in case there's anyone in the room who has a question. So,
This question is for Sonia. Great presentation.
well, people on the Zoom.
Thank you. It's good to see you again, Sonia, and great presentation. So it sounds like we're slowly making progress in terms of increasing representation in these genome-wide association studies and precision medicine research in general with the Latinx population. And I'm wondering if, based on either your literature review or your key informant interviews, if you can go over maybe some of the trends that we're seeing within that population. So as a broad group, this population has been left behind, but as representation incrementally improves, are there any populations that we might worry are being left behind in that very heterogeneous group?
What's interesting is just at how early on or how much in its infancy precision medicine is. I think a lot of the, if not all of the providers that and key informants that I interviewed were very much still in the data collection part of their work. I think they were seeing the same thing. There's so much heterogeneity. There are not exactly any trends that they're seeing yet. And if there are any populations that they feel or that they've noticed who are left behind, they made it a note to say, like, this is a group that we want to know more of. Luckily, it seems that the strategic placements of the, like, all of us consortiums have been placed so that there is good representation of all subgroups. And even the GWAS research that's been done in Mexico that's targeting tribal groups, it seems like the mindset has been from the outright to make sure that there are no small groups left behind, and that there's a mindfulness to making sure that there's representation. In terms of health trends, I don't think any of them were either brave enough to say that they have seen any, or that their research isn't just there yet.
Hello, I have another question for Sonia. I unfortunately only caught the end of your presentation, but I think you still might be able to answer this. So I recently read an article in, I think it might have been the Washington Post, saying that, you know how the US Census has always like asked about Hispanic or Latinx ancestry and ethnicity question apart from race, but that for the next census, they're considering combining that into the race question. And I was wondering what kind of impact that change might have on like medical practice or health research, just because I know the census's demographic categories often are considered like the gold standard for like other surveys and like categorizations in other spheres. So I was wondering, do you see that as like a good or bad move? Do you think that more like accurately represents how most Latinx people identify?
Yes, so I did highlight that new proposed census where they're no longer going to ask about ethnicity. And I think what has been really interesting is through my key informant interviews that I think in general the Latinx category or the population has kind of, for a lot of them, upended like their assumption of these groups or of why they need these groups. And it's also led to them saying like, there's a lot of variance within the Caucasian population, within what we call the Asian population. A man from Scotland is very different from a man multi-generation from Australia, etc. So I think that already there are a lot of these conversations happening about what does it mean to have these social categories imposed upon medical findings. But unfortunately, a lot of the key informants say that their hands are tied and they have to report this way. And that's just what they hope to be a small concession, that if they add enough protection to their work, if they have control over how their work is presented, that it won't be so detrimental, and that hopefully their work will do more good than harm.
Just to alternate, I'm wondering if anyone has a question for Alyssa? Merlin.
Hi, Alyssa. That was a fabulous presentation, and this is a really great project. I think we need more research like this at the kind of level that you're doing at to understand the political forces, I guess, on all sides of this issue. I had a question about strategy and what the people you've talked to think about the way forward. So, I mean, this is an example of bureaucratic violence, but I think it's also just an example of bureaucratic capture and how skilled one side has been at capturing a key instrument of bureaucracy and hoarding it to their advantage. Is the strategy to that you're seeing on the pro-choice end of things, hey, maybe we should play this game too, or is it something else? Because it seems like this is a hugely important instrument. It might be the most important instrument on the state level. And I'm just wondering how pro-choice advocates are thinking about gerrymandering themselves.
So that's a great question that I was kind of hoping to get. So I would say in Ohio, in terms of gerrymandering, it would be very difficult because the majority of the political power is held by Republicans, including the redistricting commission. So in terms of gerrymandering, it would be difficult to sort of take back that power at this point, but there are groups working on a ballot initiative in Ohio to get abortion access enshrined into the Constitution. And that would be through a majority vote. So, but that is also complicated now because the Ohio GOP is trying to pass a House Joint Resolution in order to make it so that instead of the usual majority vote, which would be 50% plus one, they're trying to make it so that it would be a 60% vote in order to pass a ballot initiative. So there are quite a bit of pieces at play here, but it'll be sort of interesting to see how this plays out. I just voted, or I just signed a petition 2 days ago to try to get abortion on the ballot. So hopefully that will be able to move forward with the 50% plus one majority that we've had for over 100 years in Ohio. But we'll have to sort of see whether or not this House Joint Resolution gets passed quickly enough to go into effect before this ballot initiative can be voted on. So, yeah, I think that's a great question in terms of looking at, both sides of how the response is as well and how to move forward. Thank you for that.
Hi, Alyssa. Is that on? Hi, I had the advantage of actually hearing you do this earlier, so I'm unfairly gonna badger you now about a couple of specifics. One, we keep using that term like electoral majority, but your gerrymandering example shows us that's a misnomer, that these are minorities in control. And I think it's worth sort of repeating that every time you come up with it. You went over the math of gerrymandering a little too quickly in the beginning, because your fourth column shows how a minority can look like they won something by virtue of the divisions of the electoral sites or districts, when in fact that's not a population sort of represent a fair population representation. Number one. Number two, for the doctoral students in the audience, Can you say something about how both site selection and topic emerged as part of the research itself? These were not things you had figured out in advance as part of your topic, but in fact were generated by your initial efforts to specify the work. Thanks.
Yes, so I was also hoping for that question because, and I sort of brushed past this just for the sake of time today. And I'm not sure, can everyone see the slide that I pulled up? Okay, great. So this is a really simplified version of how gerrymandering works. So for example, if you have 50 people and let's say 60% of them are blue for Democrat, 40% red for Republican, then perfect representation would be that second image, which is listed as number 1. With 3 blue districts, 3 districts where a Democrat would be likely to win, and 2 districts where a Republican would be likely to win. That would sort of perfectly represent the people in that area. Now, if you look at the third image, you can see how those people can be adjusted, how the electoral districting lines can be moved around such that you could have 5 districts where a Democrat would be likely to win. And then in that last image, you can see how those lines can be adjusted again in order to have 2 districts where a Democrat would be likely to win and 3 districts where a Republican would be likely to win. So again, this is just a very simplistic way of sort of explaining how gerrymandering actually works and how this sort of movement of these lines and this movement of people into different districts can create the outcome that a particular political party would want. So that's for the first question. And then for the second question, another great question, and Kim Hopper, of course, is on my dissertation committee and has been such a great asset, and knows that my initial sort of research questions and what I went to Ohio sort of thinking that I would find was sort of flipped on its head. From the second I got there, I kept hearing from my informants about how important gerrymandering was in this sort of fight for abortion access, and how it was the reason why anti-abortion legislation was being passed. So I didn't go to Ohio knowing that this would happen. I sort of had a question in my head about being curious about why Ohio was sort of considered more red now and what was happening. But I did not expect the number of people to tell me how disenfranchised they felt because of gerrymandering and because they felt like their vote was not counted. So that's just, I guess, a little tidbit about my research and something to consider for those of you who do plan to do ethnographic research. Your informants tend to sort of tell you what you need to know once you're on the ground, and it may not be what you expect. So thank you for those questions.
Ian, you've persistently tried to raise your hand. Do you want to unmute?
Sure. I actually have a question for two questions, one for each. So for Sonia, I was curious, you sort of briefly mentioned at the beginning, sort of the history of colonization in North America and South America. And I was curious how differences and similarities in colonial history have factored into people's perception of these categories, like genetic categories as distinct. You know, my sort of simple understanding, I guess, of colonial history is that both South America and North America had European colonization, and you would think that maybe that had similar impacts on a genetic pool. And I was curious if this came out in any of your interviews, or you know, how history sort of factors into these conceptions. Should I ask my other question and then get them both answered, or
why don't you let Sonia answer?
Okay.
So that was quite interesting. With my key informants, when I asked them about certain regions or nationalities that had a lot of European ancestry or histories of colonization, these also tend to be countries or places that are a little bit different in terms of, especially when they come to the United States, people who present as more European or more white in Latin America tend to have some sort of health advantage, so socioeconomic advantage, based on all of the reasons that we know: resources, discrimination, allostatic, load. And what has happened in terms of the research that has been coming out is that there can be more, based on the plethora of European ancestry data that we have and research, that serves that population a little bit better now at this current state than those of us who have more indigenous background, more Afro-Caribbean populations that have more African ancestry. Because just by the nature of the diversity, there's some populations within Latin America that have more European genetics and therefore more reflected in the European samples that we already have. And so it's kind of recreating this disparity between the data advantages, the knowledge, the scientific kind of endpoint of what can be done for certain populations versus others. And so in that regard, it has emerged as a topic. So yeah, I think that's one of the most salient ways, especially in terms of just genetic data, aside from all the sociopolitical and financial, economic, trails that have kept certain nationalities in lower places. So.
Thank you. And is it okay if I ask my question for Alyssa as well?
Yes, because you're a fellow doctoral student, you get to.
Thank you. So Alyssa, I was curious, you showed the sort of Dobbs Supreme Court decision at the beginning of your presentation. And I was curious, I assume you started this project before that decision, but maybe with an indication that something might be happening. I was curious how something as large as that decision sort of changed your approach to your research, if at all, or how you sort of reframed your research questions in light of that.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So I did, of course, start this research before the Dobbs decision. And I knew going into the field that there would be this turning point once the Supreme Court decision came out. I didn't know quite, what it would be, whether it would be a complete overturning of Roe or whether it would just be further erosion of abortion access, or if it would sort of be an overturning of Roe without actually saying that they're overturning Roe. But I knew there would be a shift, and more than likely a shift in access in Ohio, or at least a shift in access surrounding Ohio. So something which would change. So I went into my research knowing that would happen, and asking participants before Dobbs and after Dobbs. I guess before Dobbs, it was more like, what do you think will happen and how are you preparing for what you think will happen? And then after Dobbs, it was sort of understanding, what are your responses to this legislation and this shifting abortion landscape? So I sort of knew going in that there would be a change, and I guess prepared as much as I could for what would come, once that happened. And it was, I think, beneficial to do this research both before and after the Dobbs decision, because I was able to sort of see policy changes happening while here and while interacting and interviewing people, to get their sort of understanding of things as it was happening. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Yeah, I'm sure it was very interesting just at this time to be asking those questions. So thanks.
Do we have time for one more question? Do we have another question? We have. Angela, hold on. Quickly.
quickly, well, I won't ask the questions, I'll just ask really quickly. The strategy in some areas is to move for a mobilization or a ballot initiative to change the determination of, the anti-gerrymandering. In fact, that's what happened in Michigan. The pro women's rights and women's health were part of that initiative to change, and that's partly why at least that's the kind of a notion about it. I was just wondering if there's anything about that kind of on the ground happening there, because you can kind of get people motivated more about their vote not counting, even in the rural areas, than you can about, the abortion issue as such, but it has a consequence, as you point out. Are they doing any of that?
So just a question, a ballot initiative in terms of changing what's happening with gerrymandering, or a ballot initiative?
Changing to a nonpartisan, a separate panel or whatever that has representation from both parties, et cetera, et cetera.
So it's great that you're asking this. So there actually was a ballot initiative, I believe it was 2016, that Ohioans overwhelmingly supported, essentially nonpartisan maps. So that was voted on, and then a redistricting commission was created. So there are 2 Democrats and then I believe 5 Republicans. And so it is still majority Republican, and is still very partisan, even though there was this ballot initiative and vote to try to change this issue with gerrymandering. So it'll be sort of interesting to see if there will be further ballot initiatives trying to change that, and making it perhaps a commission that is not legislators, because I know I've read quite a bit about attempts to do that, and I think that's what you're referring to. So it'll be interesting to see, but it's interesting that there was already a vote and already an attempt to make redistricting a fair process, but it didn't work, at least this last time in 2016.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Alyssa. This is Kathy. I think you can't see us in the room, but I just want to say thanks to you, Alyssa, and to Sonia for getting this hybrid going. I know these are always interesting annual events, and it's so great to see your progress. And for the students in the room and on the screen, an N of 2 that shows the diversity of SMS. So thank you, everyone.